Ogedei Khan and the Empire's Golden Age. When Ogedei Khan ascended to the throne of the Mongol Empire in 1229, he inherited a realm that was both magnificent and precarious. The empire stretched across the Eurasian landmass like no political entity before or since, yet it remained held together primarily by the personal loyalty that various commanders and administrators had felt toward his legendary father. Ogedei's great achievement would be transforming this personal empire into a sophisticated imperial system capable of governing hundreds of millions of people across dozens of different cultures and civilizations. Ogedei's personality was markedly different from his father's. Where Genghis Khan had been stern, focused, and sometimes ruthless, Ogedei was known for his generosity, diplomatic skills, and love of luxury. Contemporary observers noted his fondness for alcohol, elaborate feasts, and architectural projects. Critics, both in his time and among modern historians, sometimes portrayed these traits as weaknesses. However, Ogedei's apparent hedonism masked a sophisticated understanding of imperial governance and the symbolic importance of displaying wealth and power. One of Ogedei's first major decisions was the establishment of Karakorum as the empire's permanent capital. Previous Mongol leaders had ruled from mobile camps following the traditional nomadic lifestyle. But the scale and complexity of the empire now required a fixed administrative centre where officials from across the known world could gather to coordinate policy and resolve disputes. The construction of Karakorum represented a remarkable synthesis of architectural traditions from across the Mongol Empire. Chinese craftsmen worked alongside Persian architects, European goldsmiths, and Central Asian builders to create a city that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Mongol rule. The palace complex included audience halls designed to accommodate delegations from dozens of different kingdoms, workshops where artisans from various cultures could share techniques, and administrative buildings housing the growing imperial bureaucracy. Perhaps the most famous feature of Karakorum was the silver tree created by Guillaume Boucher, a French goldsmith captured during the European campaigns. This mechanical marvel, powered by a bellows system, could dispense 4 different types of alcoholic beverages: wine for Europeans, rice wine for Chinese visitors, mead for northern peoples, and kumis, fermented mare's milk, for Mongols. The tree symbolized both the technological sophistication and cultural diversity that had come to characterize the Mongol Empire under Ogedei's rule. But Ogedei's most important innovation was the development of a professional imperial administration that could function independently of military campaigns. He recruited talented administrators from across the empire, creating a meritocratic system that promoted individuals based on competence rather than ethnic background or military achievement. Chinese scholars, Persian bureaucrats, European clerks, and Mongol nobles all found opportunities to advance within this system. The empire's postal system, known as the Yuan, exemplified this administrative sophistication. Building on earlier Chinese and Persian models, the Mongols created a communications network that spanned the entire empire, with relay stations positioned at regular intervals along major routes. Mounted messengers carrying imperial paesa, metal tablets that granted them absolute authority to requisition supplies and fresh horses, could carry messages from Karakorum to the edges of the empire in a matter of weeks. This communication system revolutionized both governance and commerce across Eurasia. Imperial orders could be transmitted and implemented with unprecedented speed, while merchants could travel along protected routes, knowing that they would find food, shelter, and fresh animals at regular intervals. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, became a reality as trade flourished under imperial protection. Ogedei also revolutionized the empire's fiscal system. Rather than relying solely on tribute and plunder, he developed regular taxation systems adapted to the economic structures of different regions. Agricultural areas were taxed based on land productivity, commercial centres paid duties on trade transactions, and nomadic peoples continued to provide traditional tributes of animals and military service. The Great Khan's approach to religion demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of imperial governance. Rather than attempting to impose a single religious system across the diverse empire, Ogedei proclaimed religious tolerance and actively patronized different faiths. Christian churches, Islamic mosques, Buddhist temples, and traditional shamanic sites all received imperial protection and support. The death of Ogedei Khan marked the end of an era in Mongol history. Under his leadership, the empire had achieved its greatest territorial extent and developed the administrative sophistication needed for long-term governance of diverse populations. The Pax Mongolica had become a reality, enabling unprecedented levels of trade and cultural exchange across Eurasia. However, his death also triggered a succession crisis that would ultimately fragment the unified empire and mark the beginning of its gradual decline. The European campaigns and the West's narrow escape. The Mongol invasion of Europe represents one of history's most dramatic what-if scenarios. In 1241, as Mongol armies wintered in Hungary and prepared for campaigns that could have extended Mongol rule to the Atlantic Ocean, the sudden death of Ogedei Khan forced a withdrawal that may have changed the entire trajectory of Western civilization. To understand the magnitude of this missed opportunity, we must examine both the devastating effectiveness of the Mongol campaigns and the complete inability of European forces to mount effective resistance. The European campaign began with the systematic conquest of the Russian principalities, a process that revealed both Mongol military superiority and the sophisticated intelligence networks they had developed. Subutai, the mastermind behind the invasion, had spent years gathering information about Russian political structures, military capabilities, and geographic features. Mongol merchants, diplomats, and spies had provided detailed maps and assessments that allowed the invaders to strike with surgical precision. The assault on Ryazan in December 1237 set the pattern for what would follow. The Mongols arrived suddenly outside the city walls, having moved through the winter landscape with a speed that seemed impossible to Russian observers. Prince Yuri of Ryazan attempted to negotiate, sending emissaries to discuss tribute payments. The Mongol response was characteristically direct. They demanded not just treasure, but 1/10 of everything the city possessed, including its people. When the Russians refused these terms, the siege began with typical Mongol efficiency. Chinese siege engines, operated by engineers who had perfected their craft during the conquest of the Jin dynasty, began systematically destroying the fortifications. Mongol cavalry surrounded the city, cutting off all escape routes and preventing the arrival of reinforcements. Within 5 days, Ryazan had fallen, and its population was subjected to the brutal treatment that the Mongols reserved for those who resisted. The speed of Ryazan's fall shocked the other Russian principalities, but they proved unable to coordinate an effective response. The political fragmentation that characterized medieval Russia worked in the Mongols' favor, as rival princes were more concerned with protecting their own territories than organizing collective resistance. This division allowed the Mongols to defeat Russian forces piecemeal, destroying armies that might have posed a serious threat if they had been unified. The siege and capture of Moscow in February 1238 demonstrated the Mongols' ability to adapt their tactics to local conditions. Moscow's location on high ground and its wooden palisade walls might have protected it against traditional nomadic raiders, but the Mongols approached the city with the systematic methodology they had learned in China. They built earthen ramps to overcome the elevation advantage and used fire arrows to exploit the vulnerability of wooden fortifications. Perhaps most terrifying to Russian defenders was the Mongols' psychological warfare. They deliberately allowed some survivors to escape from conquered cities, knowing that these refugees would spread stories of Mongol invincibility and cruelty. The tales grew in the telling, creating an atmosphere of panic that sometimes caused cities to surrender without fighting. The conquest of Kiev in 1240 marked the culmination of the Russian campaign and demonstrated the full sophistication of Mongol siege warfare. Kiev was the largest and most powerful city in the Russian principalities, protected by stone walls and defended by thousands of warriors. Its fall would effectively end organized Russian resistance and open the path to Central Europe. The siege of Kiev lasted for several months, during which the Mongols employed every technique they had mastered during their previous campaigns. Massive trebuchets, some capable of throwing stones weighing over 300 pounds, systematically destroyed the city's fortifications. Mongol engineers, many of them Chinese, dug mines under the walls, while infantry units, composed largely of conscripted soldiers from previous conquests, launched coordinated assaults at multiple points. Mongol columns swept across the Hungarian countryside, systematically destroying agricultural infrastructure and forcing hundreds of thousands of refugees to flee toward fortified cities. This created food shortages and sanitation problems that weakened urban defences more effectively than any siege engine. The refugee crisis also prevented King Bela from implementing coherent defence strategies, as he was forced to divert resources to managing humanitarian disasters. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Mohi on April 11, 1241, just 2 days after the destruction of Duke Henry's army at Legnica. The coordination of these simultaneous victories demonstrated the sophisticated command and control capabilities that the Mongols had developed under Ogedei's administration. King Bela had positioned his army behind the Sarjo River, believing that the water barrier would force the Mongols to attack across a narrow bridge where Hungarian heavy cavalry could use their advantages effectively. The Hungarian position appeared strong, with good defensive terrain and numerical superiority over the visible Mongol forces. But Subutai had anticipated this strategy and prepared countermeasures that revealed his genius for tactical innovation. While a portion of the Mongol army demonstrated in front of the bridge, drawing Hungarian attention and forces, other units had already crossed the river at multiple points upstream and downstream. The Hungarians found themselves surrounded before they realized what was happening. The battle that followed was a masterpiece of Mongol tactical doctrine. Rather than attempting to destroy the Hungarian army immediately, Subutai deliberately left an apparent escape route open, encouraging the Hungarians to break formation and attempt to retreat. Once the disciplined Hungarian formation dissolved into a panicked rout, Mongol cavalry systematically destroyed the fleeing forces over a pursuit that lasted for days. King Bela himself barely escaped, fleeing to the Adriatic coast while his kingdom collapsed around him. Contemporary accounts describe roads littered with corpses for miles, and Hungarian chronicles referred to the invasion as the Year of Mourning, when their kingdom nearly ceased to exist. By the end of 1241, Mongol forces controlled territory stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. No European army had been able to offer effective resistance, and the military reputation of European heavy cavalry, the foundation of medieval military doctrine, had been completely shattered. Mongol advance forces were probing into Austria and Bohemia, while intelligence reports suggested that further campaigns were being planned against the Holy Roman Empire and possibly France. European observers had no reason to believe that the Mongol conquest could be stopped by military means. The technological and tactical superiority demonstrated at Legnica and Mohi suggested that European feudal armies were simply obsolete when facing Mongol military innovation. The speed and coordination of the invasion had prevented any possibility of effective resistance through military alliance. Religious leaders across Europe proclaimed that the Mongol invasion represented divine punishment for Christian sins, while political leaders desperately sought diplomatic solutions to a military problem that appeared unsolvable. Pope Innocent IV considered calling a new crusade, but recognized that European military forces had already proven inadequate against the Mongol threat. Then, in December 1241, messengers arrived at Mongol camps in Hungary, carrying news that would change the course of world history. Ogedei Khan was dead, and according to Mongol law, all princes of the blood were required to return to Mongolia to elect a new great Khan. Batu Khan and his generals, despite being on the verge of conquests that could have extended Mongol rule across all of Europe, had no choice but to withdraw their forces and begin the long journey back to Karakorum. The European withdrawal marked one of history's great turning points. The Mongol military machine had proven capable of conquering European kingdoms just as effectively as it had destroyed Chinese dynasties and Islamic empires. The death of Ogedei Khan represented Europe's closest escape from a conquest that would have fundamentally altered the trajectory of Western civilization. The implications of this narrow escape would reverberate through European history for centuries. The shock of the Mongol invasion forced European kingdoms to reconsider their military doctrines, political structures, and understanding of their place in the world. The brief encounter with Mongol power had revealed both the weaknesses of European feudal society and the existence of civilizations far more sophisticated than most Europeans had previously imagined. The fragmentation and the four Khanates. The death of Ogedei Khan in December 1241 marked the beginning of the end for the unified Mongol Empire. What followed was not an immediate collapse, but a gradual process of fragmentation that would transform the world's largest contiguous empire into four separate khanates, each developing its own distinct character and relationship with the conquered populations under their rule. The immediate aftermath of Ogedei's death revealed the fundamental weakness of the Mongol succession system. According to traditional law, a Kurultai, a great assembly of Mongol nobles, was required to elect the new great Khan. However, the empire had grown so vast that gathering representatives from all corners of the realm took months, during which time effective central government ceased to function. The power vacuum was initially filled by Ogedei's widow, Toregana Khatun, who served as regent while the succession was determined. Toregane was a capable administrator who had learned statecraft from her husband, but her position was inherently unstable. Various factions within the Mongol elite began maneuvering to place their preferred candidates on the throne, setting the stage for conflicts that would ultimately shatter imperial unity. The succession crisis was complicated by fundamental disagreements about the future direction of the empire. Some factions, led by traditionalists who remembered the days of Genghis Khan, argued that the Mongols should return to their nomadic roots and abandon the complex administrative systems that Ogedei had developed. They viewed the adoption of Chinese and Persian governmental practices as corrupting influences that threatened Mongol identity. Other factions, particularly those involved in governing settled populations, recognized that the empire could not be effectively ruled using traditional step methods. They supported continued expansion of the imperial bureaucracy and further integration of conquered peoples into Mongol governmental structures. This fundamental disagreement about imperial identity would persist throughout the succession crisis and beyond. After 5 years of political maneuvering and temporary compromises, Mongol Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan through his son Tolui, was finally elected Great Khan in 1251. Mongol's election was achieved through what amounted to a palace coup, supported by his brothers Hulagu and Kublai, who would later establish their own Khanates. The new Great Khan immediately set about purging his political opponents and attempting to restore centralized imperial authority. Mongol's reign represented the last serious attempt to maintain the unified Mongol Empire established by his grandfather. He implemented administrative reforms designed to improve imperial efficiency, established standardized taxation systems across different regions, and launched new military campaigns intended to complete the conquests begun under previous rulers. The most significant of these campaigns was the completion of the conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China, a project that had been ongoing since the reign of Ogedei. Mongke assigned this task to his brother Kublai, who would spend years developing the sophisticated siege warfare techniques and naval capabilities needed to overcome Song defences. Simultaneously, Mongke ordered his brother Hulagu to complete the conquest of the Middle East by destroying the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and eliminating the assassin strongholds in Persia. This campaign would result in one of the most traumatic events in Islamic history and fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Middle East. However, Mongke's attempts to restore imperial unity were undermined by practical realities that no amount of political will could overcome. The empire had simply grown too large and diverse to be effectively governed from a single centre. Communication delays meant that orders from Karakorum might take months to reach distant provinces, while local conditions often required immediate responses that could not wait for imperial approval. More fundamentally, the different regions of the empire were developing distinct identities and interests that increasingly diverged from imperial policy. The Mongol rulers of China were becoming more Chinese in their outlook, adopting Confucian administrative practices and building relationships with Chinese scholar officials. Meanwhile, Mongol rulers in the Islamic world were gradually converting to Islam and adapting Persian and Arab governmental traditions. These regional adaptations were not merely administrative conveniences, but reflected deeper processes of cultural assimilation that were transforming the nature of Mongol rule. The descendants of steppe nomads were becoming sedentary rulers of agricultural civilizations, with interests and perspectives that were increasingly difficult to reconcile with centralized imperial control. The death of Mongke Khan in 1259 during the siege of a Chinese city triggered the final crisis that would destroy the unified empire. Unlike previous succession crises, this one resulted in open warfare between rival claimants, with different regions of the empire supporting different candidates. Kublai Khan, who had been commanding the Chinese campaigns, claimed the throne and was supported by Mongol forces in China and Korea. However, his younger brother Arik Boka, who controlled the Mongolian homeland and maintained support among traditional, nomadic factions, also declared himself Great Khan. The resulting civil war lasted 4 years and effectively ended any possibility of maintaining imperial unity. The fragmentation that followed created 4 distinct khanates, each developing its own political system and cultural identity. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan in China, represented the most successful adaptation of Mongol rule to sedentary civilization. Kublai completed the conquest of the Song dynasty, established a new capital at Beijing, and created governmental institutions that combined Mongol military traditions with Chinese administrative expertise. The Ilkhanate, established by Hulagu Khan in Persia and the Middle East, faced different challenges and opportunities. Having conquered Baghdad in 1258 and destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate, the Ilkhans ruled over a predominantly Muslim population while initially maintaining traditional Mongol religious practices. However, the conversion of Ghazan Khan to Islam in 1295 marked a fundamental transformation in the nature of Mongol rule in the region. The Golden Horde, which controlled the western steppes and dominated the Russian principalities, developed yet another model of Mongol governance. The Golden Horde maintained many traditional nomadic practices while extracting tribute from sedentary populations, creating a hybrid system that allowed them to control vast territories with relatively small numbers of actual Mongol administrators. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia remained closest to traditional Mongol culture, but faced constant pressure from both sedentary populations and rival nomadic groups. The Chagatai rulers struggled to maintain political stability while adapting to the gradual Islamization of their territories and the decline of the Silk Road trade routes that had provided much of their revenue. Each of these khanates developed distinct relationships with their subject populations, reflecting both local conditions and the personal preferences of their rulers. The Yuan dynasty in China implemented policies designed to integrate Chinese and Mongol elites, while maintaining clear distinctions between conquered and conquering populations. Chinese scholars were recruited into imperial service, but key military and administrative positions remained reserved for Mongols and their non-Chinese allies. The Ilkhanate pursued a more assimilationist approach, particularly after the conversion to Islam. Persian administrators and Islamic legal scholars were incorporated into the governmental system, while Mongol military traditions were gradually adapted to Persian and Arab practices. This cultural synthesis produced remarkable achievements in art, architecture, and scholarship, but also diluted the specifically Mongol character of the ruling elite. The Golden Horde developed what might be called an extractive system, maintaining clear separation between Mongol rulers and Russian subjects, while creating efficient mechanisms for collecting tribute and recruits. Russian princes were allowed to maintain local autonomy in exchange for acknowledging Mongol supremacy and providing required payments, a system that would influence Russian political development for centuries. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire represented more than just political dissolution. It marked the end of the last great nomadic empire and the beginning of a new phase in Eurasian history characterized by the rise of centralized territorial states. The Mongol conquest had destroyed many traditional political structures, but the successor khanates created new forms of governance that combined nomadic and sedentary traditions. Perhaps most significantly, the period of Mongol unity had created unprecedented levels of cultural and economic exchange across Eurasia. The Pax Mongolica had enabled the transmission of technologies, ideas, and diseases on a scale never before seen in human history. Even as the empire fragmented politically, the cultural and economic networks established during the period of unity continued to function and influence development across the continent. The four khanates would each face their own challenges and opportunities in the centuries that followed. Some, like the Yuan dynasty, would be relatively short-lived but enormously influential. Others, like the Golden Horde, would persist for centuries before finally succumbing to internal divisions and external pressures. Together, they represented the final chapter in the story of nomadic empire building and the transition to the early modern world system that would dominate Eurasian politics until the age of European colonialism. Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty. Among the four khanates that emerged from the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, none was more powerful, wealthy, or culturally significant than the Yuan dynasty established by Kublai Khan in China. Kublai's achievement was remarkable even by the standards of his extraordinary family. He not only completed the conquest of the world's most populous and sophisticated civilization, but also created a governmental system that successfully integrated Mongol military traditions with Chinese administrative expertise. Kublai Khan was born in 1215 during the height of Genghis Khan's conquests and grew up in a world where Mongol expansion seemed limitless and inevitable. Unlike his grandfather and father, who had spent their entire lives on horseback, Kublai was exposed from childhood to the complexities of governing sedentary populations. His education included not only traditional Mongol military training, but also instruction in Chinese philosophy, Persian administration, and the various cultural traditions of the empire. When Mongol Khan assigned Kublai the task of completing the conquest of southern China, he was entrusting his brother with what was arguably the most challenging military operation in Mongol history. The Song dynasty which controlled the Yangtze River Valley and southern China, was the wealthiest and most technologically advanced state in the world. Their armies were equipped with gunpowder weapons, steel crossbows, and sophisticated naval vessels, while their cities were protected by advanced fortifications and supported by efficient agricultural and commercial systems. The Song had learned from the fate of the Jin dynasty and had spent decades preparing for the inevitable Mongol invasion. They had developed new military technologies specifically designed to counter Mongol cavalry advantages, including early firearms and advanced siege defense systems. Their strategy was to use their superior naval capabilities and fortified positions to negate Mongol mobility, while relying on their larger population and greater economic resources to outlast the invaders. Kublai's response demonstrated the adaptability that had made the Mongols so successful against diverse enemies. Rather than simply applying traditional steppe tactics, he developed entirely new approaches suited to the specific challenges of conquering southern China. He recruited Chinese engineers and naval specialists who taught Mongol forces how to build and operate river fleets, siege engines designed for attacks on Chinese fortifications, and the early firearms that were becoming increasingly important in Chinese warfare. The conquest of the Song dynasty took over 2 decades and required innovations in logistics, engineering, and military organization that pushed Mongol capabilities to their limits. Kublai had to learn how to coordinate amphibious operations involving thousands of vessels, supply armies operating hundreds of miles from their bases, and govern Chinese populations while simultaneously fighting Chinese armies. One of Kublai's most important innovations was his approach to Chinese civil administration. Unlike previous Mongol rulers who had relied primarily on foreign administrators, Kublai actively recruited Chinese scholars and officials who could help him understand and govern Chinese society. He established academies where Mongol and Chinese officials could study together, and he implemented policies designed to win the support of Chinese intellectuals and merchants. This approach was controversial among traditional Mongol elites, who viewed the adoption of Chinese practices as a betrayal of Mongol identity. The civil war with Arik-Böka was fought partly over this issue, with Arik-Böka representing traditional nomadic values, while Kublai championed adaptation to sedentary governance. Kublai's victory in this conflict established the precedent that successful Mongol rule required accommodation with local traditions and institution. The completion of the Song conquest in 1279 made Kublai Khan the ruler of the world's largest and most populous country. The Yuan dynasty controlled a territory stretching from Korea to Tibet, encompassing perhaps 100 million people and including some of the world's most productive agricultural regions and commercial centers. The wealth at Kublai's disposal exceeded that of all previous Mongol rulers combined. Kublai used this wealth to implement an ambitious program of imperial construction and cultural patronage that reflected both his Mongol heritage and his Chinese environment. He established a new capital at Beijing, designed according to Chinese principles, but incorporating Mongol architectural elements and serving the needs of a nomadic ruling elite governing a sedentary population. The Beijing Palace complex was a masterpiece of imperial architecture that symbolized the fusion of nomadic and sedentary traditions. Chinese craftsmen created buildings that followed traditional Chinese designs, while Mongol elements included vast courtyards suitable for horse exercises and audience halls designed to accommodate both Chinese court ceremonies and Mongol tribal gatherings. Perhaps most importantly, Kublai developed governmental institutions that balance Mongol political dominance with Chinese administrative efficiency. He maintained the traditional Chinese examination system for selecting civil servants, but reserved the highest positions for Mongols and their non-Chinese allies. This created a multi-tiered governmental structure that preserved Mongol political control while utilizing Chinese expertise in administration and law. The Yuan dynasty's approach to religious and cultural policy reflected Kublai's sophisticated understanding of imperial governance. Rather than attempting to impose Mongol shamanism or any other single religious system, he proclaimed religious tolerance and actively patronized Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, and even Christianity. This policy helped legitimize Mongol rule among various Chinese populations, while maintaining the cosmopolitan character that had always distinguished Mongol governance. Kublai's court became one of the most diverse and sophisticated cultural centers in the world. Chinese artists and scholars worked alongside Persian mathematicians, Arab astronomers, European merchants, and Korean physicians. This cultural synthesis produced remarkable achievements in science, technology, and the arts, while also facilitating the exchange of knowledge between different civilizations. The famous account of Marco Polo, who spent years at Kublai's court, provides a European perspective on the wealth and sophistication of the Yuan dynasty. Polo's descriptions of Chinese cities, technologies, and governmental systems astonished European readers and contributed to growing European awareness of Asian civilizations. His accounts of paper money, coal fuel, and efficient postal systems described innovations that were centuries ahead of European development. However, the Yuan dynasty also faced significant challenges that would ultimately limit its duration and effectiveness. The fundamental tension between Mongol identity and Chinese assimilation created ongoing political problems that were never fully resolved. Traditional Mongol elites resented the adoption of Chinese practices, while Chinese intellectuals often viewed Mongol rule as illegitimate despite its practical benefits. The dynasty's military challenges were equally significant. Kublai launched expensive and unsuccessful invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, both of which ended in disaster due to storms that destroyed Mongol fleets. These failures not only wasted enormous resources, but also damaged Mongol military prestige and demonstrated the limits of their power. The administration of such a vast and diverse empire also strained Mongol governmental capabilities. Despite Kublai's innovations, the Yuan dynasty never developed institutional mechanisms for smooth succession, and conflicts between rival claimants repeatedly disrupted imperial authority. Regional governors gradually gained more autonomy, while the central government struggled to maintain effective control over distant provinces. Economic problems also mounted over time. The costs of maintaining the imperial court, funding military campaigns, and supporting the vast bureaucracy gradually exceeded imperial revenues. The Yuan dynasty's paper money system, initially a brilliant innovation, eventually led to inflation and economic instability when the government printed excessive amounts to fund its expenses. Cultural resistance to Mongol rule also persisted, despite Kublai's accommodating policies. Secret societies and religious movements that combined Chinese nationalism with anti-Mongol sentiment gradually gained strength, particularly during periods of natural disasters or economic hardship that were blamed on foreign rule. These movements would eventually coalesce into the rebellion that would overthrow the Yuan dynasty. Despite these challenges, Kublai Khan's reign represented one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of imperial governance. He had successfully adapted nomadic political traditions to govern the world's largest sedentary civilization, creating cultural and economic prosperity while maintaining political stability for several decades. The Yuan dynasty would last for nearly a century after Kublai's death in 1294. Making it one of the most enduring legacies of Mongol conquest. The Yuan dynasty's influence extended far beyond its political boundaries. The cultural exchanges facilitated by Mongol rule had lasting impacts on Chinese civilization, introducing new technologies, artistic techniques, and intellectual traditions that enriched Chinese culture. The Mongol period also saw significant developments in Chinese literature, theatre, and popular culture as Yuan policies created new opportunities for for artistic expression and cultural innovation. Perhaps most importantly, the Yuan dynasty established precedents for cultural synthesis and governmental adaptation that would influence Chinese political development for centuries. The idea that successful rule in China required accommodation with Chinese traditions rather than simple imposition of foreign systems became a fundamental principle of imperial governance that would be adopted by subsequent non-Chinese dynasties. Kublai Khan's achievement in China represented the apotheosis of Mongol adaptability and the successful transformation of nomadic conquest into sedentary governance. While the other Khanates faced their own challenges and opportunities, none matched the Yuan dynasty's combination of territorial extent, population, wealth, and cultural achievement. The Yuan dynasty represented both the culmination of Mongol imperial ambitions and a bridge between the age of nomadic empire and the early modern world system that would follow.